The Philistines are often remembered as the main antagonists of Israel in the biblical account, especially during the period of the Judges and the United Monarchy. The image of the Philistines as relentless enemies and, in some aspects, militarily superior to Israel, has left an undeniable mark on the biblical narrative. But the history of the Philistines goes beyond the tensions with Israel and involves everything from their mysterious origin and their prominence in the historical context of ancient Canaan, to how the legacy of this people, to some extent, endures to this day. In fact, this is a curiosity for many people. Who would the Philistines be today? Is it possible to identify any remnants of this ancient people? What really happened to the greatest rivals of Israel in the Bible? This is exactly what we will talk about in this video. Historically, the importance of the Philistines extends along the southwestern coastal region of what later became known as Palestine, where they dominated the so-called Philistine Pentapolis, a set of 5 strategically positioned cities. These city-states formed one of the most advanced and challenging political organizations among tribal peoples, establishing a system of centralized governance and military readiness, with the capability to lead coordinated attacks and defend against external enemies. But before everything, we need to talk about the origin of the Philistines, a topic that involves a lot of mystery, as this is a question that has intrigued scholars and archaeologists for centuries. The Philistines were known for their warrior character and cultural skills, and their arrival and settlement in the coastal region of Canaan mark a significant point in the history of the ancient Near East. The Philistines are often identified as part of the group known as the Sea Peoples, a coalition of migrating populations from the late Bronze Age who moved from the Aegean to the eastern Mediterranean coast, causing turmoil wherever they went. The name Philistines appears in Hebrew as Pelishtim and is also found in Egyptian and Assyrian sources. In Hebrew, the term is an ethnic adjective linked to the territorial designation of Philistia, which in turn gave rise to the later term Palestine. It is possible that this designation has Indo-European roots, suggesting an origin external to the Semitic context of Canaan and Israel. The Bible and archaeological sources indicate that the Philistines likely came from Kafta, a place generally identified as Crete. This origin is supported by terms like Cherethites, associated with the Philistines, which possibly means Cretans. The biblical narratives, especially in Jeremiah and Amos, along with archaeological records, suggest that the territory of Crete and other areas of the Aegean have been the origins of this migration to Canaan. The pottery and cultural influences of the Philistines, identified as Mycenaean or Cypriot, reinforce their connection to the Aegean world, where Mycenaean and Minoan cultures flourished during the Bronze Age. In Egyptian records from the reign of Ramses III, around 1188 BC, the Philistines are mentioned among the Sea Peoples, a group of immigrants seeking new lands and resources, reinforcing their identification as foreign invaders who arrived in the region of ancient Canaan. According to Egyptian records, he participated in invasions that led to the fall of powerful civilizations like the Hittites and city-states in Syria. The most significant incursion of the Sea Peoples against Egypt occurred precisely under Ramses III, who took pride in having defeated them and prevented their entry into Egyptian territory. Although several groups of the Sea Peoples were expelled, others, including the Philistines, were allowed to settle in Canaan, where Egyptian influence was still strong. However, it seems that despite their external origin, the arrival of the Philistines in Canaan was not a massive and destructive invasion, but rather a gradual migration and colonization. They initially settled in the coastal plain, subjugating the local population and mixing with the Canaanites. There wasn't a complete cultural replacement, but rather a fusion of traditions, which included the language and many religious and material aspects of the inhabitants of Canaan. The Bible mentions the Philistines in earlier times in the narratives of the patriarchs Abraham and Isaac, who interacted with Abimelech, king of Gerar. Although this mention may seem anachronistic to some scholars, it suggests that there was already some form of contact between groups related to the Philistines and the lands of Canaan, well before the great movement of the Sea Peoples, at the end of the 2nd millennium BC. Some theories argue that Aegean merchants and settlers established trade outposts in the region, long before the mass migration, laying the groundwork for the future Philistine occupation. The Philistines brought to Canaan a rich and varied culture, influenced by their Aegean origins, their migration experiences, and interactions with Canaanite and Egyptian cultures. Philistine culture was characterized by a sophisticated political organization, unique religious practices, advanced material production, and an adaptive linguistic identity, which allowed them to quickly assimilate local elements. All of this made the Philistines one of the most distinct and enigmatic peoples of the ancient Near East. The political organization of the Philistines was centered around the 5 main cities: Philistine Pentapolis, made up of Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron. Each of these city-states was governed by a lord who acted as both a civil and military leader. These 5 leaders formed a council that decided on matters of common interest and military issues, a unique and cohesive structure that gave the Philistines an organizational advantage over their neighbors, especially Israel, whose tribal organization was less centralized. The lords were responsible for both the governance of their respective cities and the surrounding villages, and they had the authority to summon the people, side on military matters, and offer sacrifices to the gods on behalf of the community. Although each city maintained its autonomy, the lords of the city-states would unite their forces in times of war or in response to external threats, which strengthened the defense capability of Philistia and expanded its regional power. The language of the Philistines remains a mystery, as no texts have been discovered that can be directly attributed to them to this day. Some scholars believe that, upon arriving in Canaan, they quickly adopted the local Semitic language, facilitating communication and assimilation with Canaanite culture, although expressions of their original language likely persisted even after this linguistic assimilation. Later, in the post-exilic period, mixed descendants of the Philistines spoke a dialect close to Aramaic, as mentioned in Nehemiah 13:24. Regarding the religion of the Philistines, this is a partially understood field, but biblical and archaeological sources reveal that they adopted some Semitic deities from Canaan, such as Dagon, Astarte, and Baal-zebub. According to the biblical account, Dagon seems to have held a certain prominence in the Philistine pantheon, and was worshipped in temples in Gaza and Ashdod. There were also temples dedicated to Astarte in Ashkelon and Bethshean, and to Baal-zebub in Ekron. The practice of divination was common among the Philistines, and they were recognized as renowned diviners, indicating the importance they placed on religion for civil and military decisions. The Philistines also used portable images of their gods during battles, as recorded in the 2nd book of Samuel chapter 5 verse 21. Sacrifices and rituals were conducted to celebrate and honor these gods, and there were priests and diviners responsible for such practices, especially to ward off plagues or seek counsel in critical moments, as demonstrated in the narrative of the return of the Ark of the Covenant to Israel in 1 Samuel 6. The material culture of the Philistines is rich and represents one of the few direct pieces of evidence of their identity. Philistine pottery is one of the most distinctive artifacts, easily recognizable by its spiral decorations, stylized bird figures, and geometric patterns dyed in shades of red and black. The Egyptian iconography in Medinet Habu depicts the Philistines wearing feathered helmets and characteristic Aegean clothing, such as short skirts, and equipped with spears, long swords, and circular shields. The Philistines also monopolized, in a way, the technology of iron smelting, and for a time they even prohibited the Israelites from having blacksmiths. This control over the production of iron weapons gave the Philistines a strategic advantage. Speaking of the Israelites, it is undeniable that the history of the Philistines is intrinsically linked to the people of Israel, especially in the biblical narratives, where the Philistine people emerge as the main antagonists during the periods of the Judges and the early monarchy. From the early conflicts to the great battles that defined the political landscape of the region, the relationship between the Philistines and the Israelites undoubtedly marked the history of ancient Palestine. As already mentioned, the first mention of the Philistines in the Bible, occurs during the time of Abraham and Isaac, who had encounters with Philistine leaders in Gerar. Therefore, it seems that at that time, Aegean groups had already settled in Canaan, although without the political and military power of the later Philistines. During the period of the Judges, however, the relationship between Israel and the Philistines became much more hostile. The judge Shamgar was someone who delivered the Israelites from Philistine oppression, inflicting a memorable defeat on them. However, later on, the Philistines returned to cause problems for Israel. Samson is an iconic figure from this period, an Israeli hero who symbolized the resistance against Philistine oppression. His extraordinary strength and his battles against the Philistines, including his relationship with Delilah and his final act in the Temple of Dagon in Gaza, marked a phase of direct confrontation between these peoples. Furthermore, in the early 11th century BC, Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant in a disastrous battle for Israel and destroyed the sanctuary of Shiloh. This event was a devastating blow for the Israelites and represented the peak of Philistine domination in the region. Probably due to the growing threat of the Philistines and other foreign peoples in the region, Israel recognized the need for centralized leadership. This context led to the anointing of Saul as the first king of Israel, establishing the monarchy as a form of government to unify the tribes against their enemies. Saul faced the Philistines on several occasions, including the famous battle at Michmash, where Israel achieved an important but temporary victory. At Ephes Damim, the Philistines challenged Saul, and it was in this context that David faced Goliath, the giant Philistine warrior, gaining fame and popularity among the Israelites. This confrontation, however, was not just a military victory, but primarily a demonstration of the glory and power of the God of Israel over the Philistine pantheon. However, the growing rivalry between Saul and David led the young, promising warrior of Israel to seek refuge among the Philistines themselves, becoming a vassal of Achish, king of Gath. This fact, in a way, illustrates the complexity of the relationships between the two peoples, with David operating as an ambivalent figure, both an ally and a future enemy of the Philistines. Later, after Saul's death in the Battle of Mount Gilboa, where he and his sons were defeated by the Philistines, David finally became king of the unified tribes of Israel and began a series of campaigns that resulted in the final defeat of the Philistines as a significant military force in the region. David expanded the Israeli territory and subdued Philistia, destroying the Philistine power base and imposing his own hegemony over that land. However, even after the defeat and submission of the Philistines under David, Philistia continued to exist as an autonomous entity and to interfere in regional conflicts. During the period of the divided monarchy, Philistine cities often allied themselves with greater powers or tried to exploit the moments of political weakness of Israel and Judah. Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, received tribute from the Philistines, while his son Jehoram suffered Philistine invasions that affected the stability of the southern kingdom. Another important point about the Philistines in the Bible is that the Hebrew prophets on various occasions spoke about the destruction of the Philistines, reflecting the symbolic role that this people represented for Israel. Prophets like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Zephaniah, and Zechariah foretold a grim fate for the Philistine cities, linking them to God's judgment on the nations that oppressed Israel. Jeremiah, in particular, mentioned the capture of the Philistine cities by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, as the fulfillment of such prophecies. So, you can understand that after centuries, after a certain prominence and intense rivalry with Israel and other powers in the region, the Philistines gradually lost their political and military strength. This decline was intensified by a series of external factors, including invasions by major empires, changes in political alliances, and disasters that shook the balance of power in the ancient Near East. The Philistines, whose cultural identity and political structure had consolidated around the Pentapolis, faced a long process of wear that would culminate in their complete assimilation and disappearance as a distinct people. The weakening of Philistia began with the Assyrian conquests in the 8th century BC,